Okay, so here is lecture two, week two. Talk a little bit about early Cold War actions. We'll finish up with a little bit of Kennan and his long telegram. So, one of the more popular actions that we see that could be considered part of the Cold War, I guess, in post war America would be the Marshall Plan, or what was known as the Economic Cooperation Act of 1948. Now, Europe and Asia were very much destroyed by the war. There's little production occurring because of decimated lands, factories, etc. There are droughts, which lead to an agricultural depression. Under Secretary of State Dean Acheson, we have calls for American aid to these nations. Without this, the fear is these nations will not recover. International prosperity will be limited. And of course, the lessons from Versailles and World War I showed America, France, Britain, etc., that this was not a time for isolationism. This was not a time to worry about me first, but to try to consider everybody. So again, the Economic Cooperation Act is put into place in an attempt to foster international prosperity. This is for their good. But as Acheson also stresses, it is in the self-interest of the United States, just as Truman would call for aid to Greece and Turkey in his Truman Doctrine. And here we have, again, the influence of Cold War thinking. There is free financial aid to war-torn Europe to get them started again, with an attempt, of course, to prevent them from falling under the Soviet spell. One could ask oneself, if there's no Cold War, do we feel so strongly about this act? The Soviets would respond to the Marshall Plan with the Zhdanov Doctrine, Zhdanov, Zhdanov, if you speak Russian, unveiled in October of 47. This doctrine claimed that the United States was seeking global domination through American imperialism, as well as the collapse of democracy. On the other hand, according to this doctrine, the Soviet Union was intent on eliminating imperialism and the remaining traces of fascism while strengthening democracy. Remember, Stalin is in charge at this time. And one could ask oneself, who's the imperialist in this relationship? Was the United States truly seeking global domination? I guess I would look at it, if you're going to blame one, maybe blame them both. Although the Soviets are obviously much more aggressive about finding spheres of influence and controlling them. One other thing that we see, of course, 1948 through 49, the Berlin blockade, or the Berlin airlift. In June of 48, the Soviets blocked off Berlin from the Western powers, cutting off all land access. Stalin was hoping the Western powers would simply walk away. Again, as Masny pointed out, think back to his experience in the peace negotiations of World War II, the feeling that the West would not stand in his way. So he thought the Western powers would do the same thing, that they would not want another war. For the West, this was the only democratic enclave in the Soviet zone, and we did not want to lose credibility with other nations, or particularly with West Germans. What to do? The United States and Britain began moving massive amounts of food and supplies into West Berlin by air. For 11 months, planes flew over 4,000 tons of supplies every day. This was called Operation Vittles. Stalin would look callous. Of course, we had no idea at the time how callous. And the Soviets would actually end the blockade in May of 1949. So with this action, you see, again, the United States standing up to Stalin and the Soviets. Truman is president. The buck stops here. I do want to get to one important word here. This is a word that I will call, well, the C word is how I usually refer to it, but of course, people can think otherwise. The word credibility. The Cold War was about credibility. Cold War thought, Cold War action, Cold War goals were all about credibility. Establishing and maintaining credibility, not just at home, but abroad. If we were to back down, we would lose that credibility. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of credibility when we talk about the Cold War. All right, well, let's go on. Another action we see in April of 49, NATO was founded. The Warsaw Pact would follow 6 years later. NATO arose because of concerns of Soviet expansion. The goal was to defend each of these countries from the possibility of Soviet taking control of those nations. Any attack on a member country, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, other European states, would be considered an attack on the United States. Now, not all agreed. In fact, many were against the idea of the UN itself. They believed it limited American sovereignty and would only further bloat the federal government. Robert Taft and Republicans in general believed this type of international organization was troublesome and probably wouldn't work anyway. That's what they said about the UN. I'll let you stew on that for a second. In a speech on the Senate floor protesting NATO, Taft claimed the treaty had larger potential ramifications. Quote, "I think the pact carries with it an obligation to assist in arming at our expense the nations of Western Europe," which of course would hurt the American taxpayer, but also intimated that if we protect the West, don't we also need to protect the East? Again, kind of think about that. Now, NATO, again, this is created to try to stop any kind of territorial expansion by a power. But don't we already have the UN? Isn't that what the UN is for? Of course, why do we need NATO if we already have the UN? This gets back to a discussion from the previous lecture on the Security Council. Security Council at the UN, the Soviets have a spot so they can block any measure. They can veto it. In 1949, the Soviets would develop their first atomic bomb. And we have in the United States 3 types of people in government: hawks, doves, and isolationists, which we'll get to here in a minute. Now, economically, to kind of move on from just the Cold War, business leaders sought to break from New Deal policies. They worked in courts and in Congress to foment change. Fruits of this labor we would begin to see in the following decade, in the 50s. Now, continuing, though, into foreign policy, we get to Israel and the creation of Israel and Truman's role. Now, the British Mandate of Palestine came to an end in 1947. The British had restricted entry of Jews into the Mandate, while FDR and Truman promoted the idea of open immigration into Palestine for Jews. The politics of Palestine, friends in the region who might restrict our oil if we went against them. Of course, there are Cold War considerations. This is not an easy issue to deal with at that time, let alone now. And this is one, again, that could lead to further divisions with other countries in the West. Now, the World Zionist Congress met in New York in 1942, called for an establishment of a separate Jewish state. The British were against this idea, and Roosevelt supposedly supported it. And this is part of, we talked in class about the New Deal coalition, and this is where Jews come to the fore as being part of the Democratic coalition of voters, or the New Deal coalition. We talked about farmers, minorities, blue-collar workers, and Jewish Americans would also be part of this. Part of it, again, reverts back to Roosevelt and his actions. In October of 1946, Truman officially announces his support for a separate Jewish state. Why now? Again, I would argue part of this has to do with the Holocaust. Part of it has to do with Cold War thought, and again, maintaining credibility. There is Republican pressure. Dewey planned to make this an issue in the 1948 campaign, which we'll get to in the next video lecture. Jewish claims to switch to the Republican Party for the upcoming midterms unless some action was taken by mid-1947. And there is unrest as a Jewish revolt in Palestine leads to the death of over 100 British troops. Truman's worldview, he viewed it a moral imperative for Judeo-Christian morality, and that this was the homeland for that heritage. The British would hand over the mandate to the United Nations. They would establish a special commission on Palestine. Partition was recommended, one Arab state and one Jewish state. The Jewish agency accepted, the Arabs did not. This has been the reality ever since. There is hemming and hawing in the United States and at the UN as to what to do, changes of policy and administration, as many were concerned with the Arab reaction should the United States support an independent Jewish state. May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, head of the Jewish Agency, proclaims the independence of the Jewish state of Israel. Truman voices de facto support immediately. The paper his speech was written on had Jewish state initially, as they hadn't even named it. But this was crossed out and replaced with Israel in his own handwriting. Again, you can find this document online. Very interesting, again, to show how quickly he wanted to support this. Part of it, he wanted to beat the Soviets to the punch. 5 Arab nations would attack Israel in an effort to push them into the sea and end the state, but they were defeated rather handily by a people seeking a homeland that was prepared to defend to the end that right. There's armistice in 1949. Many wars would occur over time. No peace treaty until the 1979 agreement between Egypt and Israel, Jimmy Carter's main success. And of course, for those who remember, the agreement between Egypt and Israel led to a brutal assassination of Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt at the time, for being willing to shake hands with a Jew and make peace with the Jewish people. So that gets us, we'll move on here, foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine. This comes about March 12, 1947, in a speech to Congress, in which he said, quote, "Assistance is imperative if Greece is to survive as a free nation. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished." Now, he said this, of course, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, so it's not necessarily about the majority, but I'll move on. "And is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes." Woo! So, Truman lays it all out right there. Very clear. The choice is quite obvious, although not everybody can freely choose. And of course, over time, we have realized Truman was right about much of this. And this is where we get the idea of containment, the idea to peacefully contain Soviet expansion via diplomatic means, if at all possible. And this was not initially a military doctrine, but Truman and advisors adapted it so that it could be so. Who came up with this idea? That's where we get to the 1946 long telegram from Kennan, which we will discuss now a little bit more in depth. I wanted to provide the speech and its application first because this is how it's introduced to the American people. This is how it's introduced to the world. Kennan, again, his long telegram, which is a reflection of his experience in dealing with the Soviets and in dealing with Russian history in general. He has been an envoy to the Soviets. He is well aware with their machinations. And again, I think as a statesman, he sees a very even-handed approach, recognizing that each side must be willing to do whatever it takes to provide peace. Now, some of the main ideas he puts forth in his writing, he looks at the Russian history of isolation, of its insecurity, of the secrecy involving Russian actions, and Marxist dogma. Now, if this sounds familiar, that's because it very much is. Going back to Wojciech Masny and the Soviet historian who decades later wrote about the Cold War, very much Kennan follows his line. Again, he's in tune with what's going on in the Soviet Union and how the Russian people feel. He points out this is not a fear of the people. This is not a criticism of the people, but more about acknowledgement of their rulers and the actions that they take. Soviet success requires the United States' destruction. They can allow for no threats from abroad, whether this be war-related or with regard to new challenging ideas. So again, he recognizes much of what Masny does, and that's the fact that for the Soviet way of life to succeed, others must be eliminated, essentially. Kennan argued the United States must be honest, strong, we must push our own initiatives, and a very important point, if we become like them, we lose. Keep that in mind when we get to the 60s and we get to the early 70s. Kennan had some major points. Again, Soviet power is neither schematic nor adventuristic. It is not a fixed plan, and they will not take unnecessary risks. It can easily withdraw and usually does so when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Of course, we would see this a few years later with the Berlin airlift. If situations are handled properly, there is no need for prestige-engaging showdowns. Vietnam. Number two, Soviets are a weaker force. As long as we remain firm and cohesive with our allies, we can prevent their success. Number three, there is no assurance of the Soviet Union as a long-term threat. Number four, the Soviet propaganda outside of its sphere is generally negative and destructive, thus it is easy to combat. What must we do? Kennan offered a few points on this too. First and foremost, we must understand their movement with objectivity. We must learn as much as we can and recognize it for what it is. Toss aside all subjective and biased accounts, all the anti-communist hysteria. We need to understand Marxism. We need to understand how it's applied by the Soviet Union. And we need to recognize it for what it is, not try to make it into an artificial boogeyman. Maybe it is the boogeyman, but we need to understand it for what it is. Number two, we must educate the public to the realities of the Soviet situation, both our side and theirs. Quote, I am convinced that there would be far less hysterical anti-Sovietism in our country today if realities of the situation were better understood by our people. And we have a small stake in Russia's Soviet Union itself, no investments, no trade to lose, etc. Number three, we must be a healthy and vigorous society ourselves. Quote, world communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. Kennan said, if we solve our own problems, we take care of ourselves, they cannot threaten us. Number four, we need to formulate and perpetuate a positive image of the world. Lead through that rather than through despair and fear. Number five, we must stay true to ourselves. And this, again, is, I think, the most prescient quote that Kennan provides, one that many would keep in mind while others would lose track of. Quote, the greatest danger that can befall us in coping with this problem of Soviet communism is that we shall allow ourselves to become like those with whom we are coping. I'm going to leave it at that. You can think about Kennan and his impact, his ideas, all of the predictions of his that came true, his greater understanding of the conflict between the two major sides. Again, he is willing to criticize communism. He's not criticizing the Russian people, the Soviet people. Rather, again, he says we need to be true to ourselves. We need to understand them. And we need to understand ourselves, and we cannot become like them. If we do, we lose. All right, that's video lecture number 2. Next will be the politics of the era. We'll get to Truman. We'll get to the election of 1948. And what I would argue is the most important part of this election, other than my favorite president being elected, that would be the Dixiecrat Convention. The split of the Democrats and the 4 potential candidates we see running for president.